Hey, today I'm going to show you how to use ZBrush. This video is for complete beginners, so I'm going to go click by click to show you how to detail this weapon from scratch. Now we've talked about ZBrush before when we showed you how to sculpt this alien, so if you're interested in characters, go check out that video too. But in that video, we started in ZBrush with a ball of clay. In this video, I'm going to show you another important ZBrush workflow, which is how to import existing models from other 3D programs so that you can add tons of juicy details. If you already have a model you're working on, you can use that, but I'm going to take this generic medieval sword and turn it into a weapon fit for a dark fantasy lord. If you find the follow along helpful, you can get a pro account and download my project files, link in the description. Alright, enough talk, grab your 3D models and meet me in ZBrush. Okay, so here we are in ZBrush. And before we get started on our sword project, I really need to show you around this interface because even if you know other 3D programs, ZBrush will seem really weird to you. But once you get the hang of it, it's not so difficult. So when you first open ZBrush, it'll look something like this. So the first thing you'll notice is there's this big thing here with a bunch of projects that you can import and open if you want to. This is called the Lightbox, and to open and close it, it's this button right up here in the top left. You'll also notice, probably, that your canvas is smaller than your screen. So what I like to do when I first open ZBrush is go to Document, New Document. And that will create a new document that's the size of your actual screen. This is just personal preference, but we can also go up to Documents and change the color of the background if you don't like this gradient. So here where it says Background, you can change this little range slider to change the gradient or maybe even get rid of it completely. The other thing you'll notice is this tool menu over here on the right side. And these sidebars are actually collapsible and customizable. So if you look right here, there's these little arrows, and if you double click on this, the sidebars will open and close. And you can have the same thing on the other side if you want. At the top, you can see that this one is called the tool menu, and over on the left, this one's called the brush menu. These are actually the same thing as these menus at the top. So if I click and open the brush menu, we can see that the one on the left disappears because it's actually the same thing, it's just docked over here. Same thing with the tool menu. Now if you don't want this here, you can double click on the little widget in the top right corner and it will go away, but it's always available right here. You can drag and drop any of these menus to your sidebar. So if you find that you're using the render menu a lot, you can click and drag the widget and drop it over here. So that's actually a really important thing to remember. The ZBrush interface is very customizable and everyone changes their interface when they start using it. So if you're following along with a tutorial online and you notice that they have different buttons on the left and the right, or even along the bottom here, and you can't find the buttons that they're using, just check the name of the menu and you should be able to find it here at the top. So the way I like my interface is to put the tool menu over here on the left and close this menu on the right. But once again, it's all totally up to you. I do recommend though that you at least have the tool menu out because that's the menu that you're going to use the most when you're working in ZBrush. Okay, now if you just start kind of painting here, you get this weird blobby paintbrush sort of thing. And that kind of goes back to the original intended purpose for ZBrush. Originally, years and years ago, it was more of a painting program that allowed artists to import their 3D models into the painting. So the core of the program is still set up kind of like a painting program, even though very few people actually use it that way these days. So that's what explains all of the weirdness that we're about to encounter with the interface. Now, if you want to get rid of all this blobbiness and clear your canvas, just hit Control-N for new. And that's how you clear the canvas. Now over here on the tool menu, you can see this big orange S, that's the simple brush, and that's actually the tool that we're using. If we click on that and open it up, we can see a bunch of other tools. For example, Cube 3D. You can click and drag, and now it's going to draw cubes on the canvas. And notice as I click, it's going to just keep drawing more and more cubes. And again, that goes back to the original intended purpose of ZBrush, which is more of a painting program. So imagine you're painting a landscape, but you have a model of a 3D tree. You could just kind of slap a bunch of trees in your scene. So that's why it behaves this way when you just click and drag on the canvas. Now I'm going to hit Control-N once again to clear the canvas. And if we want to actually edit the cube, we need to draw it on the canvas and then go up here to edit mode. The hotkey is T. Now if I click on the canvas in empty space and drag, it's going to turn it like the camera's moving. So now's a good time to talk about the camera controls. So like I just said, to turn the camera, you just click and drag an empty space. You don't have to press any other hotkeys. If you want to move the camera, you hold down Alt and drag an empty space, and you'll start to move the camera around. If you want to zoom in, this is the weird one. You hold down Alt and you start dragging, and then you let go of Alt, and now it's going to zoom. That seems weird. It's nothing like any other 3D program, but if you use this program with a pen tablet, it's actually really intuitive and really fast to move your camera around when you're sculpting. Now you may notice that the cube looks a little bit distorted, and that's because we currently are in orthographic mode. Perspective is turned off. To turn that on, we're just going to press P for perspective, and now the cube seems less distorted. Now, if we want to sculpt on this cube, we actually have to make this cube into what's called a polymesh 3D, because these default shapes are not actually 3D shapes, so we have to convert them. But in the future, when we import our model, we'll be able to skip this step. But for now, I'm going to click on Make Polymesh 3D right here in the tool menu. And now I'm able to sculpt on this by just clicking and dragging on the model. Now you can change the brush size up here. We get the draw size, we get the focal shift, which is kind of like feathering, and we get the intensity. Now the hotkey, if you want to change the size of your brush without going up to the top, is you just tap S, and now we have a draw size slider. If you want to change the intensity, you press U. And if you want to change the focal shift or the hardness of the brush, you can tap O. Now another hotkey that's really useful is kind of the universal hotkey, which is spacebar. If you hold that down, you get draw size, focal shift, and intensity just like before, but you get all these other things too. So if you're painting, you have your color palette and a bunch of other useful stuff. So just clicking and dragging on the model will sculpt outward. If I want to push inward, I'm going to hold down Alt while I sculpt. That pushes inward. And if I want to smooth, I'm going to hold down Shift. And there's kind of an extra little secret one, which is relax, which is very similar to smooth, but slightly different. And the way you relax is you hold down Shift and you start smoothing and then you let go of Shift. And now this is kind of like smoothing, but it also tries to maintain the volume a little bit. So that's a useful one as well. And I've made an apple. Now we need to learn a few more tools and functionality before we can start sculpting on our project. So the cool thing about ZBrush, and the thing that sets it apart from other 3D programs, is you can have really high polygon counts. And that's how it allows you to sculpt really detailed meshes. So over here in the tool palette, I'm going to open up the geometry menu, and we see this big button right here that says divide. If you click that, you can see now we're at subdiv 2, so we've divided the mesh. And if we look over here at our mesh, we can see that we have more polygons now. I can hit divide again, and now I'm at subdiv 3, and the mesh looks even more smooth, and we can sculpt more details. The hotkey to add subdivisions is Control D. Be careful, you don't want to go too high, because if your computer is not very fast, you could crash it, but normally it gives you a warning if you've reached some upper limit. You can see I've pressed divide a few times, and I'm currently at subdivision level 6, and if I look up here at the top of the screen, I can see that I have 500,000 active points, which means 500,000 vertices. Another place to see your current polygon count is to roll over the tool, and I can see I have 500,000 polys right there. Another cool thing about ZBrush is you can go up and down the polygon levels. You're not stuck with this really high polygon count. So if I go back over to the tool palette, to the geometry window, I can turn this subdivision slider down, and you can see that the model goes back down to subdivision level 1. The hotkey to go up and down the subdivision levels is you just tap D for divide. I'm not hitting Control D because that will add a new one at the top. But if I press D a few times, it's going to go up to subdivision level 6. And if I hit Shift D a few times, it's going to go back down to subdivision level 1. When I'm at level 6, I can hit Control D to add a level 7 at the top. Another tool that we're going to be using during this tutorial is masking. If you hold down the Control key, you'll notice that the word mask appears right by your cursor and it turns yellow. Now if I paint on the model, it paints this dark shape, and if I try to sculpt, you can see I can't affect anything inside the dark shape, so it's masked off. If I want to invert the mask, I'm going to Control click once on the canvas, and it will invert. And if I want to clear the mask, I'm going to hold down Control and drag a box on the canvas, making sure not to touch the model. That clears the mask. If I touch the model, it's just going to add to the mask like this, but if I drag a box without touching the model, the mask goes away. Now another cool thing that you can do with masks is you can Control click on the mask itself and it will blur and soften the edges. So now there's a soft transition. If you want to undo what you did, you can press Control Z like any other program, but ZBrush also has this history slider up here at the top. If I click and drag on this little orange box to the left, it's going to scrub back in time. Now be careful with this though, because if you scrub back in history and then you make changes, you get this warning that says the current active undo history is not the latest one. So if I press OK, it's going to erase all of the history. Okay, let's talk about different brushes. Right now we're on the standard brush. If I click here in the top left, you can see that ZBrush has probably hundreds of brushes, and I actually don't know what a lot of these do because some of them are very specific and very unique. But I'll just show you the few that I use the most. So first of all, obviously the standard brush, which is the one we're on. I also really like the one called Clay Buildup. It's similar to the standard brush, but it has kind of a square profile to it, which I feel keeps my sculptures under control. You'll notice that a lot of beginner projects in ZBrush look kind of bulbous and inflated, and that's because they're sculpting with the standard brush, but if you sculpt with this clay buildup, it sort of keeps everything under control. It's also really good for creating texture and directionality to your sculpture, because you can see it leaves your brush strokes behind, and then when you smooth, you can leave some of that in there, and it's kind of like free extra detail. The next brush that I use all the time is the Move brush. Now you'll notice it's kind of hard to find, so let me show you the easiest way to find a brush in this menu. If you know you're looking for a certain brush, just type the first letter, so in this case M for Move, and that shows you all of the brushes that start with M. Notice they all each have a little orange letter in the corner as well. If you press that key, it'll then select that brush. So for example, if I know that the Move brush has a V, I can just type V, and now it grabs the Move brush. So when you start using the same brushes over and over, you kind of just learn the 3-letter hotkey for each brush. For example, if I want the pinch brush, I press B, P, I for pinch. Or another brush that I like a lot is the morph brush, so I'll press B, M, G, and I just know that that's the hotkey for morph. But again, if you don't want to memorize the 3-letter hotkey, you can just press B for brush, and then the first letter, M for move right there, and then find your Move brush. So the Move brush is very useful for changing the proportions of your model. It's not really like a sculpting brush. It really just kind of grabs the mesh and stretches it in whatever direction you move it, similar to like a soft selection tool in Blender or Maya. Now every brush has an alternate function when you press the Alt key. For the sculpting brushes, the Alt key usually just does the opposite, it pushes inward. But with the Move brush, if I hold down Alt, it's going to move the mesh in the normal direction, which means away from the center. So if I click and drag here and I move it, it's just going to drag it around, but if I hold down Alt, it's going to actually move it towards the camera because that's away from the center of the mesh. Yeah, I just want to show you a couple more things before we start sculpting on the sword. The next one is DynaMesh, which is a very useful feature in ZBrush. So if you're using the Move brush and you start stretching the mesh, you might start to notice that it looks kind of crazy, like it's being torn up. And that's because we're actually stretching the polygons farther than they should go. If you press Shift F for wireframe, you can see the wireframe of the model, and you can see we're stretching it way too far. It's starting to break. So what if we could create new geometry as we sculpt? For that, we're going to use DynaMesh. Now, a word of warning, if you use DynaMesh on a model that you created in another program, which already has good UVs and good edge flow, DynaMesh is going to ruin all of that. So you don't normally want to use it on a model that already has good UVs and has already been modeled with really specific edge flow. You really should only use it for models that are created in ZBrush as like a ball of clay from scratch. But over here in the geometry menu, I'm going to go to DynaMesh and I'm just going to turn it on. So we get this warning that says the mesh has multiple subdivision levels. As we know, we've subdivided the mesh. It's asking if we want to freeze the subdivision levels before entering DynaMesh mode. I'm going to press no. So notice what it did. It actually created new geometry on the stretched out part of the mesh, which is really useful. Because let's say I want to create a creature with big horns, like this. So I start pulling the horns out of his forehead, and I can see that the wireframe is stretching. Well, if DynaMesh is active, you can actually just control drag a box like this on the canvas, similar to drawing a mask, and it will create new geometry there. So it's kind of another weird hotkey, but it feels very natural once you get used to it, to just be sculpting and then realizing, oh, I need some more geometry. So I just click and drag, and I get some more geometry like that. Now I can smooth it out. Okay, and the last feature I want to tell you about before we start actually working on our project is Subtools. So over here on the left side, right above the geometry menu, there's a subtool menu. If you open that up, we currently have just one subtool, but if I click on the append button, I can grab one of these other shapes off the menu. So maybe I want to add a cylinder to my project. And notice now I have 2 subtools in the list. If I click on a cylinder, you can see right here, I have a new cylinder kind of pushed into the center of my model, because that's the middle of the scene. If I want to move this out so I can look at it, I'm going to click up here in the top left where it says Move, Rotate, and Scale. The hotkey is E and R, so I can move it out of there. And if I want to go back to sculpting mode, I'm going to click on Draw mode. The hotkey is Q. So now I can start sculpting on this geometry. Now, it's important to know that each subtool has its own history slider. So if I press Undo, it's going to undo what I've done to this model. Notice if I smooth this all out, and then I jump back over to my original subtool, this shape, and I press Undo, it's going to undo what I did to this model. Even though the last thing I did was smooth out the cylinder into a sphere, the Undo slider is going to affect just the subtool that I currently have active. So that's something else to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about saving and opening and importing and exporting and all that stuff, and then we can import the sword. So in most programs, when you want to save something, you go up to File, Save As, right? Well, in ZBrush, you don't necessarily want to do that every time, because remember what I said way back in the beginning, this was originally more of a 2D painting program. So if I go to File, Save, what I'm saving is my painting, the entire canvas. So if you have a lot of things in there, a lot of different models, if you have lights, it's going to basically save your painting. But if I want to save my 3D model, then I want to save it in the tool menu. Because one of the weird things about ZBrush is your 3D model is called a tool or a Z tool. It's not called an object or a model, it's called a tool. And then the things that we would normally call tools in other 3D programs, in ZBrush they're called brushes. So these are brushes, and then this actual object is called a tool. So if I want to save my tool, if I want to save my 3D object, I'm going to go save it here as a Z tool file. And then later on when I want to work on it and I open up ZBrush, I'm going to load it here. I'm going to click on Load Tool. So we want to do all of our loading, saving, and importing in the tool menu when we're working on a 3D model in ZBrush. Okay, I'm going to clear my canvas, and to do that, I'm going to turn off edit mode. It's going to ask me if I'm sure I want to do that. I'm going to say yes, let's switch it. And to clear my canvas, I'm going to hit Control N for new. Now, we didn't delete our model. It's not gone. It's still here in our tool menu right here. So if I want to bring it back and work on it again, all I have to do is drag on the canvas and press edit. And now I'm back to working on my tool. If I want to clear this, I'm going to turn off edit mode and press Control N. Now let's import the sword. When you're importing a new model or loading a Z tool that you've already made, it's best practice to switch to the simple brush before you import. And the reason for that is if I have something here as my active tool, when I import something else, it's going to overwrite whatever's here in this box. So I always switch to the simple brush before I import anything. So with the simple brush active, I'm going to click on Import in the tool menu, and I'm going to select the Fantasy Sword OBJ. Let's draw this on the canvas and click Edit. Okay, looking pretty cool. I'm going to press F for Frame, and I'll press P to make sure that Perspective is turned on. You can see the button right here. And let's inspect this model. I'm going to hit Shift F for Wireframe, and we can see the wireframe of the model, and you might see that each section is a different color. That's what ZBrush calls polygroups. It's recognizing that each of these meshes is a different object. They're not physically welded together. If you don't see different colors, then you can go over here to the tool menu and open up the polygroups menu and hit auto groups. And it's going to randomly assign a new color or polygroup to each part of the mesh. Now I'd like to break this up into separate subtools so that I can work on each part independently without accidentally messing it up. Because as you can see, if I grab my move brush and I want to widen the sword blade, it's affecting every other part of the model, the hilts and the handle. So if I want these to be separated, the easiest way to do that is to first get them into separate polygroups like we just did, and then go over to your subtool menu on the left, go down to the split submenu and click on group split. You get this warning that says it's not undoable. That's fine, just press OK. Now you can see here in our subtool palette that we have 4 subtools. Each part of the mesh is now a separate subtool. If we want to rename these, we can do that. So I've got this one selected. I can see it's the handle. It's the one that's lit up. So I can click on rename and I'll call it handle. You can press down to go to the next subtool down, and I'll press rename and call this one blade. This is the hilt, and the last one is the pommel. Notice that my handle disappeared. That's fine. It's just this little eyeball. You can turn off the visibility of the different subtools. Oh, something I forgot to mention. If you don't like this red color, you can actually change the material right here. But this doesn't actually change anything about the model. It's just for visualization purposes. So feel free to play with it and find the one that works best for you. Okay, let's get working on this thing. I'm sure you noticed though, if you press Control D to smooth, the model kind of looks like it's all soft and squishy now. There's no definition to it anymore. So we can press undo, and there's a couple things we can do to make sure that the edges that are supposed to look sharp stay sharp. And for what I'm about to show you, you want to make sure your wireframe is turned on. So press Shift F if you don't see that. So the first thing we could try is creasing all of the edges that are sharper than a certain number of degrees. So over here in the geometry menu, we can click on the crease submenu and press crease. And any edge that's sharper than a 45-degree angle will be creased. And you can actually see that here. It's kind of hard to see on the screen, but notice that some of the edges have kind of a double line around them. Those edges are creased. So now if I hit Control D for divide, I can see that these edges have stayed sharp. So it's working there, but what if we want to control manually which edges stay sharp? We can do that. Let's press Control Z to undo. Now, first of all, it's kind of tedious to press Control D for divide and then undo if it's not right. So let me show you how to temporarily smooth things so that you can make sure your settings are right before you divide for real. And to do that, you want to make sure that your model hasn't been divided yet. See how I have no subdivisions? Now if I press D instead of Control D, we get this window that says this mesh currently has 0 subdivision levels. Would you like to auto-activate dynamic subdivision instead? And I'm going to say yes. So dynamic subdivision is a preview. It's not actually subdividing the model. It's kind of like a modifier in Blender where it's not real yet. It's just showing us what it's going to look like. And so we can make changes to which edges are creased, for example, and we can see what the result will be when we actually do smooth before we decide to actually smooth. If we go over here to our geometry menu, we can see we still don't have any subdivision levels, but if I go to dynamic subdivisions, I can see that dynamic is turned on. Okay, so here is how we manually crease certain edges. I'm going to press B for brushes, and I need to find a brush called ZModeler. So I'll press Z, and here it is right there, ZModeler. ZModeler is ZBrush's hard surface modeling brush. It's very different from modeling in any other program, and it's actually pretty complicated, but we're only going to use one function, so we'll try to keep it simple. But here's how it works. Notice when I roll over the mesh, different components light up. So if I'm rolling over a face, the face lights up and I get this orange line as I go around. If I roll over an edge lights up, and if I roll over a vertex, the vertex lights up. So the way this tool works is context sensitive. Notice when I roll over an edge, there's text that says insert edge loop. That's telling you what's going to happen if I click on an edge. And just to show you, if I click, I get an edge loop that I can insert right there. I'm going to press undo. If I roll over a face, I get QMesh a poly, which is kind of like extruding. That's kind of nice. And if I roll over a vertex, it says move points. So I can move vertices like that. Now, if I want to change what the brush does, I'm going to roll over the component that I want to change. In this case, it's edges, because remember, we're trying to crease them to keep them sharp. And you hold down the space bar, and this is all the things that you can do to edges, and then this is the target. So what I want to do is crease, and I could either crease a single edge or an entire edge loop. For now, I'm just going to crease one edge at a time. So now when I roll over an edge, notice it says crease edge. So I'm going to click that, and now this edge will stay sharp. And I'll do the same thing to this one. Let's do the same on the back side of the sword. Now if I press D for dynamic subdivision, I can see the preview. This edge here is going to stay sharp. We can actually work in this smooth preview mode. I'm going to roll over this edge like that. Now I don't want to go down the full length of the sword, creasing all the edges. So I'm going to roll over this edge and hold down spacebar, and I'm going to change my target to edge loop complete. So it's going to crease the entire edge loop all the way down. I'll do the same thing here on the blade to get the sharpened part of the blade right there. Let's just go ahead and check the full length of the sword to make sure it looks good all the way down. And it looks all right. So now I want to crease it for real. To do that, I'm going to hit Shift D to turn off the smooth preview, the dynamic subdivision. And now I'm going to crease it for real by hitting Control D. And we're adding real subdivisions now. If you want to see what the mesh looks like, you can hit Shift F to turn off the wireframe. And I'll hit Control D again to add another subdivision. Notice that it's smoothing out. I'm going to maybe do one more, Control D. And now the mesh is looking pretty dense, which is good. But the edges are looking a little bit too sharp now. To give them a slight bevel, what I like to do is uncrease them all once I get to about subdivision level 4. You can see here we're at subdivision level 4. So I'm going to go down to crease and press uncrease all. And that's just personal preference, but I like to give my edges a slight bevel by doing that. So now next time I divide, it's going to bevel those edges ever so slightly so they catch the light. So I'm currently at subdivision level 6, which in this case is about 368,000 polygons for just the blade. Maybe I'll divide it one more time, Control D, to get to subdivision level 7. Okay, now I'm going to repeat that process for each of these pieces. I won't do them all on camera. Okay, so we've got a nice smooth divided sword with the proper creased edges. Let's go ahead and save our subtool now so that we don't lose our work if we crash. Up at the top of the tool menu, I'm going to go to Save As, and I'll call this Fantasy Sword 2, since I've already been working on one. So now we're ready to start modifying this thing or adding detail. At this point, if you want a historical sword, it's kind of already done. You can just bake your detail maps and call it a day, but I really want to make a fantasy, kind of evil, dark lord type sword with lots of spikes and maybe a skull and a crazy blade and all kinds of stuff like that. That's a good idea to have some sort of concept art if you can, or if you don't have concept art to work from, at least pick some sort of a concept to work from. So in this case, I think I'm going to have the sword look really organic. I'm going to have fewer sharp straight lines, and I kind of want it to look like it's made out of like raw meteor iron or something like that, and forged into a rough shape, kind of like the orcs' weapons from Lord of the Rings. It's really rough and unfinished. So I think I'm going to start with the crossguard here, or the hilt. Now here's a quick thing to speed up your workflow. Instead of going to the subtool palette and clicking on hilts like this, You can also Alt-click once on different subtools, and it will jump between them. So if you ever see me quickly switch to a different subtool without going to the subtool palette, that's how I did it. I just Alt-click once. All right, I'm gonna grab my Move tool so I can change the proportions. So I'm gonna press B, M, V. It's the quickest way to get to the Move tool. And I want to work in Symmetry so that I don't have to do the same thing on both sides. So I'm gonna press X for Symmetry. I'm also gonna turn off Perspective over here on the right, or you can press P, and that's gonna help me make some really clean, straight movements. So with a nice big brush, let's see if we can make a more interesting shape for this crossguard. Now, notice it's starting to kind of lose some volume here. So if you start to lose volume, you can use a brush called the Inflate brush. So if I press B, I, and search for Inflate, this will do exactly what it sounds like. It's gonna blow up the mesh like a balloon. Or if you press Alt, it's gonna deflate. But be careful with this because it'll turn backwards really easily, and you definitely don't want that to happen. So I recommend with the Inflate brush, you turn your intensity way down here at the top. Now there's another way that we can rotate this, and that's with the actual Rotate tool. So I'm going to Control Drag and mask off the end of this hilt, and then I'm going to Control click over and over inside the mask, which will blur it out, just like before. Now I want to invert the mask so that we're only working on the end here. Now I'm going to switch to my Rotate tool up here at the top. Now if you don't see the Rotate tool come up, the widget is probably down here in the center of the scene. What we can do to get it up here where we want it is to hold down Alt and then just drag it where we want it to go. If you're holding down Alt, it's going to move the widget instead of affecting the mesh. And notice when you're pressing Alt, this little lock opens and closes. So that's how you know it's going to be affecting the mesh or not. So I'll just move this into place right about there. And if I rotate around, I'm just checking to make sure it's inside the center of the mesh. Looking pretty good. And now we can rotate this. Cool. Let's go back to our draw mode, clear the mask by holding down Control and dragging a box. And now we can kind of smooth this out. Very nice. Let's go back to our Move brush. And really quick, something that will really help you out with speed and efficiency is if you notice up here, your recently used brushes are on the top row. So you don't have to hunt for them every time. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of stretch this out and make a more sinister, sort of evil looking shape. Now, hard surface modeling in ZBrush is pretty challenging, and that's one of the reasons I'm making a more organic shape. So I'm not too concerned if it looks a little bit lumpy, because there's ways to refine it, but also, again, I want to make it look sort of rough and unfinished. Okay, I think that's a pretty good silhouette for now. It's nowhere near done, but we're just kind of blocking out the idea in our head. Let's play with the shape of the blade now. So I'm going to Alt-click to switch over to the blade. I'm going to press X to turn on Symmetry for the blade. And let's just start playing with some ideas here. Maybe we can make spikes in the blade like this. That looks pretty cool. Here's a fun tool that we can try. Press B for brush, press S for spiral, and search for the spiral brush. This brush does basically what it says. If I click, it's going to start spinning the mesh in a circle. Now it's going to stretch like crazy, so be very careful, but it's going to spin clockwise, and if I hit Alt, it's going to spin counterclockwise. So if I turn down the intensity of this brush, I can make kind of some interesting wavy shapes in the blade. Be very gentle with it though. It can get out of hand pretty quickly. Jumping back to my Move brush to try to make like an interesting little arrow shape. Notice I'm making very small movements here, and I'm checking it frequently from the side to make sure I'm not changing the overall shape of the blade from that angle. We don't want it to end up looking bent and crazy like this. So do very small gentle movements because it's a very thin piece of geometry, and it's going to be really easy to accidentally turn it inside out. We definitely don't want to do that. Okay, that's looking sufficiently sinister. I think I want kind of a skull detail right here, as if the hilt are the skull's horns. So I'm going to jump over to RenderCrate because I remember we have this old skull model on the store. So I'm going to go ahead and download the lowest resolution one because we don't need the textures. And it looks like it's an OBJ, which is perfect. So let me show you how to import this into ZBrush and append it to our sword. So the quickest way to do this is to go to the Z plugin menu, go to the Subtool Master menu, and press MultiAppend. This allows you to select multiple OBJ or FBX files and attach them as subtools to your model. So I'll click MultiAppend, and I'll click on the skull OBJ and press Open. Now you can see we got this giant skull in the scene. I'm going to click on the skull subtool and press Shift F, and you'll notice that by default it has two different polygroups. We can see the skull is one polygroup and the lower jaw is another. Now I don't want the lower jaw, I really actually want to get rid of it. So we're going to do that with ZBrush's visibility tools. So really quick, just to give you a tour of the visibility tools, if you hold down Control and Shift, notice up here the tool changes to the select rectangle. If you click and drag, you get this green rectangle, and anything inside the rectangle is going to remain visible. If you messed up and you want to undo what you did, you can hit Control, Shift, and just click once in empty space. If you want to invert your selection, you hit Control, Shift, and drag a box in empty space, and that will invert your selection. And then the other thing you can do is hit Control, Shift, and Alt to invert. So now anything inside the red square is going to be deselected. So that's the basic selection tool, which controls the visibility of objects. Now, these faces are still here, they're just not visible. They're not actually deleted yet. So let me show you how to delete the faces that are invisible. But first, we need to make a proper selection here. So I'm going to Control, Shift, click once on the canvas, and that's going to undo my selection and bring everything back. Now, the cool thing about this is if you Control, Shift, click on a polygroup, it hides all the other polygroups. So the jaw is still there, it's just hidden. But I want to delete it for real, I don't want it to come back. So with the jaw hidden, I'm going to go down to the Geometry submenu, and I'll go to Modify Topology, and I'll click on this little button right here that says Delete Hidden, or Del Hidden. So we didn't see anything change, but those invisible faces are now gone. If I Control, Shift, drag, they don't come back. Cool, that's what I was looking for. So now I'm going to switch to my Scale tool, and I'll scale this thing down and position it in place. Maybe I'll actually squish it a little bit so that it's flatter. Doesn't need to actually be as deep as a real skull. Now I'll go back to draw mode, and I'll switch to my move brush. I'll press X for symmetry, and I'm going to flatten out the back of the skull like this. When it looks fairly good, I'm actually going to duplicate the skull and mirror it to the other side. Here's the quickest way to do that. In my subtool palette, with the skull subtool selected, press duplicate. Now we've got two skull models in the same place. With one of them selected, I'm going to scroll down to the deformation menu, and I can see there's a mirror button. Now right now it's going to mirror on the x-axis, which is left and right. That's not exactly what I want. So if you look really closely at the mirror button, there's little XYZ on there. I'm going to click that tiny little X to turn it off, and I'll click on the tiny little Z to turn that on. So now it's going to mirror in the Z-axis. I'm going to press mirror, and I can see it flip around backwards like that. Pretty cool. Now I want to combine these two subtools into one subtool, so I'm working on both of them at the same time. Let's go back up to the subtool menu, and I'm going to click on the skull that's on top, because when you merge two things in ZBrush, it merges downward. Then I'll go to the merge submenu right here, and I'll click on merge down. It's going to give you a warning that you can't undo this. That's fine with me. I'll just press OK. And now they're one subtool. But we can see that the meshes are just kind of like crossed over each other still. So let's combine them into one object for real and kind of squish them together like clay. And for that, we're going to turn on that DynaMesh feature that we talked about earlier. So let's scroll down to Geometry. Let's open up the DynaMesh submenu and press DynaMesh. Now notice that it just kind of gets really undetailed. We lose all the detail, and that has to do with DynaMesh resolution. If that happens, just press Ctrl Z to undo. And before you turn on the DynaMesh button, turn up the resolution slider here. Now be careful, it doesn't have to go all the way up. It may have to, but just test it first. So if I turn it all the way up and hit DynaMesh, I can see now the mesh has a lot more polygons. In this case, it actually looks like it's an okay resolution, but it really depends on the starting size of your model. So you don't always want to just turn the resolution all the way up. It's just a case-by-case basis. Now one thing you'll notice is that the teeth look kind of weird. There's all these weird gaps and they kind of fuse together, but not really. So let's fix that before we turn on DynaMesh. I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo. And before I turn on DynaMesh, I want to inflate these so they're touching and there's no gaps between the teeth. So I'll press B for brush, and I'll find the inflate tool by pressing I, and it's right here. Now I can very softly inflate these until the teeth are all touching, and then we won't get those weird gaps when we turn on DynaMesh. Now this isn't really anatomically correct. You don't actually want your teeth to fuse, but we're pretending this is a sculpted metal detail on a sword. I imagine the teeth wouldn't be individual separate objects. Okay, let's turn our DynaMesh resolution back up and press the DynaMesh button, and now it's looking pretty good. I'm just gonna hit Shift and start smoothing away some of these facets so we get a nice smooth surface. Okay, now that I have the skull in here, I think it's going to be a lot easier for me to decide how I want to shape the horns. So I'm going to click back on the hilt, jump back to my move brush, and let's start making some changes. Again, I want to make this sort of more organic and flowy. Still looks a little bit too much like a gummy bear, kind of, very soft. But again, I'm just kind of sketching out the shape, and I'll sharpen up all the edges and things that I want to look kind of mean and dangerous later on. Now, if you're going to be stretching this too much, eventually it's going to start tearing the mesh like we talked about. And so it might be a good idea to turn on DynaMesh for this object as well. In fact, if I turn on wireframe, you can see that my wireframe is getting really stretched out and kind of torn up. So let's do that. Let's turn on DynaMesh for the hilt. going to crank up my resolution and hit DynaMesh, and now we're in DynaMesh mode. Once you're in DynaMesh, you don't really need to press Ctrl D to add more subdivisions because DynaMesh allows you to add more detail. To make the end of this a little bit sharper, I'm going to switch to my inflate brush. I'll make sure my intensity is very low, like maybe 1 or 2, and then I'll hold down Alt and slowly deflate the end of this hilt to make it sharp, and then smooth it out. And once again, don't forget to check your sword from the side view. You want to make sure that you're not bending it in this direction or anything like that, unless that's what you're going for. That could actually look pretty cool if you do it purposefully. This is actually the fun part of the project for me. I feel like a lot of the technical stuff is taken care of. We've got it set up right, and now you can just kind of be artistic and go with the flow and let the inspiration take you where it's going to take you. I don't want it to look too refined. But at the same time, it is a metal object, and so eventually I'm going to add some sharp edges to make it look like it's hard, because right now it definitely just looks soft and not very dangerous. In fact, let's talk about that now. So there's 3 tools that I like to use to make things look a little bit more hard surface. The first one is the Damien Standard brush. You click on the brushes and press D. It's this one right here that's called Dam Standard. And this brush by default actually pushes inward. And if you want to push outward, you hold down Alt. This brush basically makes really sharp cuts or really sharp ridges. It's also good for making organic details, like if you're doing a face and you want to add some wrinkles. But if you're doing mechanical things or hard surface things, this can be used to refine and sharpen up corners. So I'm going to be using this brush a lot. Another brush that's good for adding sharper, more hard surface looking details is the Flatten brush. So if you press B for brush, F for flatten, it's right here. And this does basically what it sounds like. If you start sculpting, you'll notice that it kind of creates flat facets. So if I wanted this to look like rough hammered metal, I could just kind of flatten out some of the most round areas. Or I guess this could also be used to make like wood branches or tree trunks or something like that, or bark. Pretty cool. Let me undo that. Another brush that's good for making hard surface looking details is the pinch brush. And this does also what it sounds like. If I click and drag, it's going to pinch the mesh together. So I'll be using all of those tools to make this look a little bit sharper and slightly more hard surface. Don't forget to add some details to the skull. I'm not going to go too crazy here. I'm just going to make it feel a little bit more intentional. Again, I want to make it look like a carved or forged metal object. And you know, this is an evil sword, so maybe I'll make it look a little more angry too. There we go. The Dark Lord would be pleased. Maybe I can use the move brush to make the teeth look a little bit sharper. I can use that Damien Standard brush to separate the teeth, give them a little bit more definition. There we go, that looks pretty mean. Okay, let's use those same tools to make the hilt look a little meaner too, because again, it looks like a weird gummy bear right now. And now that I'm seeing these, I think I'm going to sculpt them like goat horns or ram horns, where they're concave on the inside and then convex on the outside. Getting a little closer. I noticed that the tip of this though is kind of mangled, this right here. I don't think it's salvageable. So what you can actually do is mask off the part you don't like. And then over here in the tool palette, we can go down to visibility and click on hide part. Oops, that was actually the opposite of what we wanted, so let's undo. First, I'm going to invert my mask and then I'll click on hide part. So now the end of that is hidden. It's still there, but it's hidden just like we did with the skull. Let's delete it for real. So in geometry, I'm going to go to modify topology and hit delete hidden. So now it's gone. And next time I update DynaMesh by control dragging on the canvas, it's going to fill in that hole. So we can kind of start fresh and fix that area. Now that I've got kind of a rough silhouette going here, I'm going to start using the flatten brush to sort of define and discover interesting planes in the model and maybe make it look a little bit more like a hard metal object instead of clay. Okay, now I recommend you jump around between different parts of your models periodically. Don't just focus too much on one part because it can be overdeveloped and then the rest of it can look underdeveloped. So the hilt is definitely not done, but I'm going to switch to the blade for a while just so I don't get burned out working on one piece. So let's alt click on the blade and I want to sculpt on it a little bit more to make it look more like unfinished metal. Now the problem is this is a very thin piece of geometry and it's very easy to accidentally turn things inside out or make one part of the mesh punch through the other. So for example, if I were to just start sculpting with the clay buildup tool like that, notice that the other side of the mesh comes through as well. So the first thing I want to do is turn on a feature called automatic masking. So with my clay buildup tool selected, I'm going to go up to brush, I'll go down to auto masking, and I'll turn on back face masking like this. So now when I sculpt, it's still a little bit too heavy-handed, but if I turn it around to the back, I can see it's not affecting the back side of that thin surface. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make the blade wider because it's actually really thin, and this is more of a fantasy weapon, so I think it's okay if we make it a little bit fatter. So I'm going to go to my scale tool up here, and I want to make sure that this widget is right in the middle of the blade. To do that, I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'll click on the home, the little house. That's going to snap the widget to the middle of the scene. Now I can inflate it in the Z direction, which is the blue box, and just make the blade fatter. It's still going to look pretty sharp, but that's going to give me more leeway to sculpt some interesting details. And the last thing I'm going to do to make sure I'm not too heavy-handed is I'm going to turn the intensity of my clay buildup brush way down. And now I can sculpt some nice, subtle, organic detail into the blade. I think I'm going to refine these wavy shapes to make them look a little bit sharper. Now it kind of looks like raw iron or maybe something organic like bone. That'd be kind of cool if we texture it like bone. We'll see what happens when we get into Substance Painter. Nice, that's looking pretty mean. Okay, let's not neglect the end of the sword up here, the pommel. I'm not really sure what to do with this to make it thematic. Maybe we can make it like a big evil looking like gemstone, you know, glowing with evil light. That'd be kind of cool if it's like a crystal. So let's mess it up. I'm gonna go to my move brush and I'll just start kind of messing this up and making it a more random shape. So it looks more like a rock instead of something forged purposely. That could be kind of cool. Now, if I want this to look like a crystal of some sort, maybe I could use my flatten brush for that. I'll just start adding facets to it from all different angles. I'm not sure how evil that looks. Maybe I can think of something for it later, but it's a good start. All right, it's looking really cool now. So let's add a little bit of fine detail. Now, this is a phase that would normally take me a long time. I would normally spend a long time doing really little details in ZBrush. But for the sake of time for this tutorial, I won't go too crazy with it. And besides, details are also things that we can add in the texturing phase in Substance Painter. So if I know that the blade is going to be made of bone or something like that, I can use a bone material in Substance Painter to create pits and scratches. But if you want really specific details, like maybe we want this gemstone at the top of the sword to have a really distinct crack along the surface, then we should do that here in ZBrush. For this, I'm going to use a brush that's kind of a niche brush. You don't use it on every project, but it's really powerful. I just want to give you an idea of the things that ZBrush can do, because we can't really go through all of these brushes, but here's a really cool one. And it's called the Morph brush. You can kind of think of it like a history brush. And I'll show you what I mean. So I've got the pommel selected, and I'm going to scroll down in the tool menu and find the Morph Target submenu right here. And then I'll click on Store MT, which is short for Store Morph Target. So now it's recorded this point in the history of this object. So I'm going to grab my clay buildup tool and I'm just going to carve in some really rough damage right here. So it looks like there's a crack sort of running along the length of the gemstone. And now if I go to the brush menu and I search for morph, what this does is it'll go back in time to the point where I pressed the Store Morph Target button. So if I sculpt, it looks like I'm sculpting outward, but really it's just going backwards in time to reverse what I did. So this brush is actually really cool because you can change your focal shift here at the top to make a really sharp brush like that, and then use this to create interesting cracks in the surface. Maybe we can even change the alpha of the brush to something hard and square like this one right here, alpha number 28. And we can use this to decide exactly how we want the damage to look without messing up the original shape of the gemstone. So one thing I like to do is really spray on the damage and then repair it with that morph brush. Let me show you another way to spray on damage or detail. I'm going to switch to my standard brush. You'll notice that throughout this tutorial, I haven't really used the standard brush very much. I actually kind of don't like it, but I like to use it as kind of a blank slate to create my own custom brush. So with the standard brush activated here, I'm going to go to the stroke type and change it to spray. And then I'll go to the alpha and choose maybe alpha number 23, these spots. What this does is it's just going to spray detail on. That's kind of intense, but we can turn down the intensity of the brush. We can use this to really quickly add a stony texture. So if you want the gemstone up here to have a rough stony texture, give this a try. And don't forget to change your brush size and get different size pits and details. I'm just going to kind of spray it all over. Maybe go back to my clay buildup and add some more really deep, crazy damage like this. But then I'll go back to my morph brush and I can repair this. And going back and forth this way, you can create really interesting organic stone textures. I do want it to look like a gemstone, so I'm going to repair most of it so that most of the surface is flat and smooth, but it has some dings and scratches. So as I said, for the sake of time, I'm not going to add a ton of detail like that all over the model in ZBrush, but typically I could spend days doing this on a project. Okay, I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup and organization and a little bit of smoothing away some facets that are still kind of showing up in the model, and then we'll be ready for the next phase of the project. So first of all, I want the hilt and the skull to be one object. I want to combine them together. So to combine these, I'm going to go up to Subtool, and I want to make sure that the hilt and the skull are right next to each other in the list. So I'll grab the skull and just drag it right here. And now I'm going to hit Shift F for wireframe, and I can see that my skull is DynaMesh, but my hilt is not. So that's not good. Let's convert this to DynaMesh really quick. So with the hilt layer selected, I'm going to go to Geometry. I'll go down to DynaMesh, and I'm going to crank the resolution all the way up. Remember what we said earlier? You don't always want to crank the resolution all the way up. You want to test it to see if that's a good setting, because that could be way too many polygons. But if I hit DynaMesh, it's going to ask me if I want to freeze the subdivision levels. I'm going to say no, and I can see that that's actually a pretty good level of detail right there. Now that I have more polygons, I can actually gently smooth away some of the facets that are here on the model. And now because the skull and the hilt are both DynaMesh, we can combine them into one object really easily. So over here in the subtool palette, I can see that hilt is on top of the skull. And when you merge things, they always go downward. So I want to have the hilt selected because it's the one that's on top. And I'll scroll down to merge down. You're gonna get a warning that you can't undo this, so be sure that you actually want to do it. Or maybe save first if you're not sure. But I'm gonna press OK. And now the hilt and the skull are one subtool. If I go to my wireframe, I can see that they're still overlapping. So what I can do is control drag a box and empty space to update my DynaMesh. And now they've been welded together and fused, which is good. So if I wanted to, I could actually sculpt across them now because they're one object. But I don't think I want to do that in my case. Okay, once again, I could detail this thing for days, but I'm just going to move on to the next phase for the sake of time. The next phase is Retopology. Now, this model has way too many polygons overall to be usable in any sort of film or game project. So if you look up here in the top right, I can see my model currently has 2.6 million polygons, which again is way too many. So we need to create a lower poly version of this model, which is more optimized for games or film. And then what we'll do in Substance Painter is bake the detail from the high-res model onto the low-res model. So it'll just exist as a normal map or even a displacement map if that's what you need for your project. So I recommend saving your project really quick. So in the top left in the tool menu, I'm going to click on Save As and save my Z tool. So I need a high poly version of this model, which I already have, and I need a low poly copy of it as well. So let's group this into a little folder by going over to our subtool menu and clicking on New Folder. I'm going to call this one Sword High, and then we're going to click and drag our subtools into the folder. Now I want to duplicate this entire folder and all of its contents. So I'll click on the little gear and go down to duplicate. Now it might look like nothing happened, but that's just because ZBrush's interface is weird. But if you scroll up, the copy is actually up above it right there. So I'm going to close this folder. I'm also going to hide the visibility of this one so we don't see it. Then on this folder, I'm going to click on the gear and choose rename. And I'll call this one Sword Low. That's probably also a good idea to rename all of your subtools. So this is my pommel low. I'm going to rename it to pommel low, handle low, and so on for all the parts. Okay, now we're ready to do our retopology. So I've got the high-res version of the sword in a group, and the group is hidden. So we're only looking at the low-res one. Now for some of these subtools, if we look at the wireframe, we can see that they're actually not DynaMesh. We never pressed DynaMesh, so we probably don't need to do any retopology. Let's just check. If we hit Shift D to go down in subdivision levels, we can see that it maintains the shape, roughly. It doesn't drastically change in shape between level 1, 2, 3, and so on. It kind of stays the same. So this one might not even need to be topologized. Same thing with the handle. In my case, I kind of barely touched it. So if I go down in subdivision levels, I can see that it basically maintains the same shape all the way down. So this one's also okay. Now for the hilt, I've turned on DynaMesh. So there is no lower subdivision level now. This is just what the model looks like. So we need to create a lower subdivision. And ZBrush is actually fairly good at doing this automatically. The only thing I really don't use it for is creatures' faces, because those need really specific edge loops and edge flow to make animation work properly. But this is a hard surface model and it doesn't deform. It's never going to bend. And so we can do some auto retopology and it will be pretty decent. So let's just see what it looks like with default settings and then we can make adjustments from there. Over here on the left side, I'm going to go to the Geometry tab and I'll click on ZRemesher, and I'll just click on this big button that says ZRemesher. And it's going to calculate for a little bit, and there it is, it's done. Then you can see it's actually not terrible. There's some areas that I think we can fix, but overall, it looks all right. And yeah, it looks okay, but if you want to make some changes, just press undo, Control Z, and here's how we can make those changes. First of all, you may notice that your model is changing shape. If that's happening, it's because you have Symmetry turned on, and it's going to mirror your model. And in my case, I actually don't want that. I purposely made it asymmetrical. So I'm going to press X to turn off Symmetry, because remember, we want this to match as closely as possible to the high-res version, so we can't change the shape too much at this point. Next, notice we have two different polygroups. We have green and blue here, and that's because we merged two different models together. ZRemesher is pretty good at putting edge loops in between polygroups if we want. So if I want an edge to separate these two areas, we can do that. I'm gonna click over here on Keep Groups inside of the ZRemesher window. Let's see what that does for us. I'll press ZRemesh, and we get a pretty good result. It's one model, but there's an edge loop separating the horns or the hilt from the skull. So if we wanted to, we could UV map this separately and texture it separately. That's pretty nice. And if we look up here in the top right corner, we can see that this hilt is now 10,000 polygons. If that's not a good number for you, if you want to go lower or higher, I'll show you how to do that next. So let's press undo, and we'll jump over here again to the ZRemesher window, and notice this slider that says target polygon count 5. That 5 is 5,000, so multiply whatever number you see there by 1,000. That's the target number of polygons that it's trying to hit. And you can see it doesn't do a very good job. It's trying to get down to 5,000, but because of the other settings, it's only getting down to 10,000. So if you want a lower number, maybe you can click and type in 2 to try to get 2,000 polygons. Again, it won't get that low, but just lowering this number a little bit will lower the final polygon count. So let's see what this looks like. Let it process, and you can see we've hit 5,000 polygons. Now, if you want a really low poly model, you can see it doesn't do a great job at ultra low poly. These teeth are kind of mangled and weird. So if you really do need a very low poly model, maybe you're making a mobile game or something, I recommend doing manual retopology for that, because you'll get the exact topology that you want. But that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. If you guys do want to learn more about manual retopology, just leave a comment down below. Now, we focus more on VFX than games here at ProductionCrate, so I'm going to go back up in polygon count because I don't actually need a super low poly model for our purposes. And I'll press ZRemesh, and hopefully this is the final one. Yep, that's looking pretty decent. One thing I do when I think I have the final asset is I click here on the history slider, and I go back one and then forward one, just back and forth like this to see if it's drastically changing. So what I mean by that is I want to see if the silhouette is changing drastically on any part of the model, because that means we're going to get a bad bake. So if these spikes were kind of disappearing on the low poly version, that would be bad, but it looks okay. All right, let's do the blade. So if I alt click on the blade to switch to that subtool, I can see that we still have subdivision levels. It's not DynaMesh, but we have a problem. If I hit Shift D to go down in subdivision level, I can see it's drastically changing shape. We're losing that silhouette, especially down here. So that's not going to bake very well. And in this case, it's probably best to convert it to DynaMesh and then do ZRemesher, like we did with other parts of the model. So now we have a nice DynaMesh model. And now let's do ZRemesher. So I'll click on ZRemesher, and I always just press the default settings just to see what needs to be fixed. So I'll press ZRemesh at the default settings, and it almost never works on just the first try, but when it does, it's pretty nice. Okay, and if I isolate the blade, I can see some areas that I definitely want to fix. First of all, we have this detail that's kind of a drastic sharp edge, but it runs diagonally across the topology that is created with ZRemesher. And if we look at the model, that creates this really weird diamond faceted look. You definitely don't want your edge flow going diagonally across major features like that. So let me show you how to fix that. It's actually pretty cool. So if I press undo to undo my retopology, I'm going to go to my brushes menu, and I'll press Z, and I'll look for ZRemesher guides. So this is a tool that allows you to guide the edge flow that results from ZRemesher. So what you can do is just kind of drag and paint the edge flow that you want. Now, you're not actually creating an edge. It's not going to necessarily put an edge right there. You're just kind of telling it, I want it to sort of just flow this direction, and it'll try to figure it out for you. So let's see if just doing that fixed the area. So I'll go press ZRemesh, and you can see we get a much better result in the edge flow. The edges are going in the direction of that detail. If we look at the other side, we can see the old bad way. So let's go down the model and see if we have any other things like that, and then we can use this brush to fix those details. So I'll press undo. Oh, and let me show you actually really quick how to delete a curve if you accidentally drew one on that you don't want. So it's pretty easy. Just with your ZRemesher guide brush active, hold down Alt and just kind of paint a little bit of the curve, and it'll delete that whole brush stroke. Okay, just want to make sure that this ridge down the middle of the sword stays really straight. So with my ZRemesher brush, I'm going to click and drag and hold down Shift, and that'll make a straight line. Now it's kind of wonky, so I don't recommend doing the entire length of the blade at once. I'm going to do it in sections, and you can actually pick up where you left off by rolling over, and you can see the end of it turns green. It might be kind of hard to see on the screen, but it'll turn green, and that's going to show you that you're starting where you left off. So I'll click and drag and hold down Shift and just go down the center ridge of this blade. And now some of these ones that are really prominent, it might be a good idea to trace those too. Okay, don't forget to do the same thing on the other side. And then let's click on ZRemesher and see how it goes. Okay, let's press Shift F to look at the wireframe. I can see that it's mostly pretty good. One thing you'll notice about ZRemesher is it doesn't really do good, sharp details. So I wouldn't do this for something like a gun or anything mechanical like that. I'm using it on this project because this is supposed to look like roughly forged, sort of like a raw organic fantasy metal, or maybe even bone. We'll see what happens. But again, I wouldn't do this for something mechanical or intricate. Okay, next step is UV mapping. Now, once again, ZBrush can do this automatically, but it's not always the best. We can try it to see if it'll work, because if it does, it'll save us a lot of time, but you probably have to UV map in whichever 3D program you like best. So if you want to try out ZBrush's automatic UV mapping, here's how we can do it. So the quickest way is just to use the default settings by going up to Z plugin, going down to UV master, and clicking on unwrap. This will unwrap the current subtool. And that's it, it's actually done. If you want to see the result, you can come over here to your tool menu and go to the UV map sub palette and click on morph UVs. So here's the UVs that it created. Not the best, not very optimized, right? Now, if you don't know how to UV map in a different 3D program, you can just use the default unwrap, and it'll honestly work just fine in Substance Painter. You'll just have seams in weird places that are not super optimized. Now, UV mapping, kind of like retopology, is a long process, and it's kind of outside the scope of this video. So if you do want a video specifically on UV mapping, I'll leave a comment down below. I'm going to switch to my hilt low. So for this one, if you're going to do the automatic UV mapping on this one, here's a little tip that can help you out though. Because this one has multiple polygroups, in the Z plugin, you can actually tell it to maintain polygroups. And let's see the result of this. It's kind of random, but it will actually work just fine in Substance Painter if you don't have access to other 3D programs and you're only using ZBrush. Now, for the handle though, if you didn't ever turn on DynaMesh and therefore didn't mess up the edge flow, the handle was actually already UV mapped. If you press Morph UV, you can see it's laid out kind of nice. So there's nothing to do on this one. Same thing with the pommel. I never turned on DynaMesh for the pommel, and so if I press Morph UV, I can see it's actually laid out okay. But definitely feel free to go to Z plugin and press unwrap if you want to change up the UVs for it. In fact, in this case, I feel like I got a better result, so maybe I'll leave it. Now, for those of you who do know other 3D programs like Blender or Maya or Cinema 4D, and you want to be able to export your models to those other programs to make changes to them, let me show you how to do that. Again, we won't spend too much time in other programs, but it is an important step of the pipeline to be able to export and re-import altered models back into ZBrush. So let me show you guys how to do that. So to finally export this thing to another program, I'm going to turn off the visibility of all the subtools except the one that I'm working on by clicking on these little eyeballs over here in the subtool layers. So right now I'm just looking at pommel low. Let's go ahead and go to Z plugin and then go to the subtool master submenu, and I'll press export. And I want to make sure I turn on single polygroup for each subtool. Otherwise it might break up your model into weird chunks and no one wants that. I'll press OK, and I'll point it to where I want it to export. I'll call this one pommel low _ no UVs. And we'll repeat that for each part of the low polygon sword. We don't need to export the high polygon one right now. Okay, and when that's done, just jump over to your favorite 3D modeling program, whichever one you like, and import all of those OBJs. And one thing you want to know is you don't want to move this model at all, especially if you're planning on going back into ZBrush, because it needs to be in the exact same place to make sure all the details line up after you're done modifying it. So even if the model comes in at a weird size, in a weird place, or like upside down, just leave it where it is because you can fix that after we're done with ZBrush. But if it doesn't line up when it goes back into ZBrush, it's going to cause problems. So at this point, if you know how to UV map, or if you want to do a little bit of fixing the topology, go ahead and do that in your favorite program. But make sure you don't change the overall shape. Think of this like a shrink wrap around the high resolution model. If it doesn't match the surface shape of the high resolution model, then we're going to have a lot of problems when we try to bake the details. So don't make any changes to the actual shape and silhouette of the model at this point. Okay, and here's my result from manually doing UVs. Again, you don't have to do UVs in another program. You can use the UVs that ZBrush gives you, and this will work just fine. But I'll put my version into the project files if you want to follow along with exactly the same thing I'm doing. If you did do UVs and retopology in another program, now I need to show you how to bring it back into ZBrush. So I'm going to select each part individually and export it as an OBJ. And I'll be sure to name it blade low, pommel low, hilt low, and handle low. Okay, now jump back into ZBrush, and what we need to do is import our models on top of these ones and replace them. So right now I have my pommel low selected, and I'm also on the lowest subdivision level because that's the one that I exported to Maya. So I'm just going to press import, and I'll grab pommel low right here. And chances are you'll see that nothing happened. If the only thing you change about the model is the UVs, then what it will do is just replace and overwrite the model. Now, if you did do retopology and change the edge flow, you might get a warning that says you need to project the details. If that happens, just press OK. Okay, now I'll go down to my handle and I'll go to import and I'll grab handle low, go to my blade, import, blade low, and then lastly my hilt, import, hilt low. Okay, everything's looking pretty good. So in this case, I just imported it to make sure that everything still matches and aligns where it's supposed to. But the next step now is to get everything out of ZBrush. ZBrush is one of those programs that I could spend forever inside, doing all kinds of texturing and detailing, but for the sake of time, we need to move on, and I'll do more detail in the texturing process. So now we need to get the high res and the low res out of ZBrush and into whichever modeling program you prefer. I'll use Blender this time. Now, if you already exported these models for UV mapping like I did, then you already have the low poly versions outside of ZBrush. But let's get the high res versions now outside of ZBrush. So I'm gonna go over here and turn off my sword low folder and turn on my sword high folder. And I'm just gonna click on each one individually and check their polygon count. So this first one, the pommel, actually has 1.2 million polygons, which is really high. It probably doesn't need that many polygons, and if I were to export it now, it would probably be too big and make Blender run pretty slow. So let me show you how to reduce the number of polygons in the model without losing any detail. Now, this is only something you should do when you're done sculpting because it makes it harder to sculpt on later. So if you're done and you just want to reduce the number of polygons, but keep all of your detail, here's how you do it. So since this is kind of a destructive process, I'm going to make a third copy of my models so that I don't destroy my high-res sculpt in case I want to make changes later. So over here, I'm going to click on the gear from my folder and I'll duplicate again, press OK. Don't forget that you might have to scroll up to see the duplicate that you made. And I'll turn off the visibility for one of them so I only have one visible. And then I'll rename one of them Sword Decimated. And I'll click on my first subtool right here and we'll go down to the Geometry tab. And you can see I'm currently on subdivision level 7. I'm going to press Delete Lower. And now it only has one subdivision and it has over 1 million polygons. So now we need to decimate this. Decimation will basically reduce the polygons where it can, like on the smooth areas, but it'll leave polygons where it needs to, like on the cracks. So to do that, we're going to go to Z plugin and then go to the called Decimation Master, which is pretty epic sounding. And I'll press Pre-Process Current. Now this is probably going to take a few minutes. You can see the progress bar up here on the left. It's actually going pretty quick, not too bad. And once it's done, go back to Z plugin, down to Decimation Master. And now we can choose either the percentage of polygons we want to keep or the maximum polygons we want to have. So for example, if I want to have 300,000 polygons, you can see that's going to be 11% of the total. Now I'll press Decimate Current, and we can see that it reduced the number of polygons in the smooth areas, but kept more polygons in the detailed areas. And if I turn off my wireframe, I can see it looks pretty good still. Okay, let's just do that for each one. So we'll jump over to my handle. I can see that I have over 700,000 polygons, but it's a very smooth object. It probably doesn't need that many to maintain this level of detail. So I'm going to go delete my lower resolution, go up to Z plugin, and I'll press Pre-Process Current under the Decimation Master menu. And once that's finished, I'll go back up to Z plugin, Decimation Master, and maybe 200,000 will be enough for this handle. So I'll press Decimate Current, and it looks the same to me, but if I go to my wireframe, I can see there are fewer polygons. Okay, next I'll go to my blade. This one already has under 400,000 points, so I think I'm actually going to leave it how it is. I think it's going to be all right. And same thing if I go to my hilt. This one only has about 300,000 polygons, so that's totally fine. Okay, now it's time to export these. Let's turn on all of the subtools that are inside of the Sword Decimated folder, and let's go to Z plugin. I can close Decimation Master and open up Subtool Master, and I'll press Export, which will export the visible subtools. So I want to make sure only the ones inside of the Sword Decimated folder are visible. Now I want to export a single polygroup for each subtool. Otherwise, it'll be broken up into chunks. You can export it as a single file if you only have one object or one subtool, but I think I'm going to export multiple files, so one file per subtool. I'll press OK, and I'll navigate to my project folder. It's getting kind of cluttered here though, so I'm going to add a new folder, and I'll call this Sword High Parts. Open that up and press Save. So now it's going to go through and export each of our subtools as a separate OBJ, and we can see that here. Okay, now it's time to hop over to whichever 3D program you like best. I'm most comfortable with Maya, but I have a feeling most of you probably use Blender, and I'm trying to get better at it, so I'm going to do this next part in Blender. Okay, so here I am in Blender, and the goal now is to import our objects and organize them and name them properly so that we can bake them in Substance Painter and start texturing. So I'm going to go File, Import, Wavefront OBJ, and I'll navigate to my folder where I exported the high-res models. Now I don't need the MTL file, I only need the OBJs. And here we can see the OBJs in Blender. Now, if you zoom in really close, you can see that the surface is faceted. So we want to right click and say shade smooth on all the parts. Or if you get really weird burning artifacts like this, you might want to right click and go shade auto smooth instead. So just pay attention to the results you're getting. Okay, let's go over here and name these now in the outliner. You can name this however you want. Just make sure that you name it consistently. So I'm going to go blade underscore high with a capital H. This one is called pommel underscore high with a capital H, hilt, and handle. Okay, now let's import the low resolution versions. I'm going to go File, Import, Wavefront OBJ, and I'll grab blade low, handle low, hilt low, and pommel low. So I'll import all of these. And let's actually hide the visibility really quick of all of the high-res versions by clicking on the little eyeball. And now we can double check what these ones look like. So same thing on these, just to be safe, I'm gonna right-click and say smooth shade on each piece. It's probably a good idea to double check that the UVs transferred over okay. So I'm gonna switch to my UV editing window, and I'll make sure I'm in edit mode and select blade or whichever part. And then in the top left corner, there's this little double arrow that you can click on, and it'll show you the entire UV map. So if I select all my parts in object mode, I can see over here that the UVs match what I did in Maya. Or if you did it in ZBrush, you just want to make sure that everything looks like it's laid out flat the way you did it in ZBrush. Okay, pretty cool. Now, just to stay organized, it's probably a good idea to create a material with a proper name so that when we're texturing in Substance Painter, we see that name and it names all of our textures by that name. So if you click on the shading tab up here at the top and then click on your model, you can press new, and where this says material 001, I can call this sword matte. Now, you can assign the sword matte to the entire model if you want to, especially if all of your UVs fit into one square. But if you happen to lay out your model where each piece has its own UV texture set, then you want to assign a new material to each piece and name it differently. In my case, all of my UVs are on one UV sheet, so I can make one material for all of them. So I'll click on the blade and I'll assign my sword matte to that. Same thing with my handle, just like that. And you don't have to do this for the high-res version, just the low-res version. Okay, I'm going to double check over here one last time before I start exporting that the blade high and blade low are named exactly the same, except one says high and one says low, and the capitalization is the same. Same thing with handle low, handle high, and so on. So now let's select all the ones that say underscore low, and let's export an FBX, because Substance Painter likes FBXs better. So I'm going to go up to File, Export, and I'll name this sword underscore low. And I'll click here where it says limit to selected objects. I only want to export the low res versions right now. And I'll press export. And then let's switch to the high res versions and we'll select all those. Go File, Export, FBX. We'll rename this sword underscore high. And again, make sure it says limit to selected objects. Jumping over to Substance Painter now. We got to get this thing imported and set up. Now I am going to go click by click so that you can follow along, but I'm not going to go much deeper into Substance Painter beyond just what we have to do for this project. So if you want to go more in depth and learn more about Substance Painter, be sure to check one of our previous videos on the subject. We've got this intro video right here where we texture a robot from scratch. We've got this one here where we texture a car. And if you're more into characters, we have this one here where we texture a character. And all of those are beginner tutorials. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to go File, New. And then when this window opens, I'm going to go File, Select. I'll go down to Sword Exports, and I'll grab my Sword Low FBX. You can set your document resolution. I recommend just going to 4K. You can always change this later if you want to. And then for the normal map format, there's no right answer here. It just depends on which program you're going to end up in or render in. So if you're planning on rendering in Blender, you want to go OpenGL. If you're planning on using this asset in Unreal Engine, then you want to go DirectX. I'm going to go OpenGL. And then I'll go down here and press OK. And now it's open. Okay, we're almost ready to start painting, but not quite yet. We need to bake our details or bake our mesh maps. And you don't have to follow along with this part. I just want to show you really quick why that is. So if I go over here to my Smart Materials tab, which is the second one, and I drag one of these on here, like this bone stylized, I can see that it kind of looks like bone, but it kind of doesn't really work. If I roll over the thumbnail, you can see that it should have kind of brown, dry, dusty shadows and then lighter colored edges. But if we look at our model, we don't see that. That's because the computer right now doesn't know where the deep recesses are and where the edges are. So we need to bake our maps. So up here in the top left, I'm going to click on this little croissant icon and we get our baking window. Now, first thing I want to do is assign the high polygon mesh that we created. Over here, you can see this little window that says high definition meshes. Just going to click on this tiny little file and grab the sword high. Now we can see that the model looks kind of crazy. It kind of turned blue and there's this weird yellow cage around it. So the blue is the high res mesh. And you can see it's kind of flickering white. That's the low res mesh. And we can see that they're on top of each other. So we get this flickering effect. That's good. That tells us that they're in the same place. Now the cage is the distance that it's going to look away from the surface to find details when it's baking. And I can see it's looking really far into space and there's no details out here. So over here under the cage settings, I can turn down this slider that says max frontal distance. And we can see the cage will shrink. Now you want to be careful here because if you shrink it too far, it'll start to turn red. And what that's showing you is where the high-res model is outside of the cage, and so it won't bake those details. And you'll get kind of flat surfaces or plateaus. So I want to make it just big enough that I don't see any red pixels, but not so big that the cage is kind of overlapping on itself. It doesn't need to be this big. Now if we look right here, we can see the low polymesh suffix and the high polymesh suffix. This is what I was talking about, where your naming convention needs to be consistent. So right now it's going to look inside the X files for the models inside, and it's going to look at the naming convention that we chose, and it's looking for underscore lowercase low and underscore lowercase high. Well, I used uppercase letters, so I'm going to change that L and that H to uppercase. And it does that so it knows to bake the details from the high-res skull onto the low-res skull, and the detail from the high-res blade onto the low-res blade, and so on. Okay, now we are finally ready to bake our maps. So down here at the bottom, I'm going to click on Bake Selected Textures. And you should see a bunch of colors flying across your model. Okay, once it's done, go back up to the top right and click on the little paintbrush to go back to the painting mode. And we're ready to start texturing. Now quick test, let's drag and drop that same bone stylized onto the model. And I can see I'm now getting the result that I was expecting. It looks like bone, it's got some dust on the surface, and it's got more dust in the deep recesses, and it's lighter in color on the higher corners. All right, and now you can go ahead and texture the sword. Remember that you can download the project files from ProductionCrate. The link will be down in the description. If you don't know how to use Substance Painter yet, I recommend you follow along with one of our beginner texturing tutorials. You could use the project files from those videos, or you could use the sword asset to follow along. If you do want a video on how to texture this sword specifically with all these cool glowing effects, be sure to leave a comment down below, and I'll make a Substance video just for that. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you'll be ready right when that video comes out. If you do sculpt your own version of this sword, or you make any cool textures in Substance Painter using my sword, be sure to tag us on Instagram with it or post it to the Discord, because I'm definitely curious to see your interpretation. All right, later creators.